after Dark Side of the Ring season 1 came out, we were basically we noticed that The Rock had seen the show and he had tweeted about it, which was mind blowing for us as fans. We never would have thought that it would have been seen by someone like him.
You know the man I'm speaking to as the brains behind the highly successful and highly controversial show Dark Side of the Ring. And he may have outdone himself with his brand new series, Tales from the Territories. The first episode is available to view for free on the Vice TV YouTube channel. But there are a lot more episodes coming. How are you doing, Mr. Evan Husney?
Hey, how you doing? Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So what was the motivation behind going all the way back to the territories? Because I mean, you are 36 years old, right? So you're not exactly the generation that belonged to that era. What was the motivation? Right.
Well, for me personally, I've always had like a interest in the territories. Getting back into wrestling. Sometimes being a wrestling fan, you take little breaks and then you come back to it, and you kind of how wrestling evolves with culture. That's kind of been my experience with wrestling. Like, I got into it when I was a really little kid during Hulk Hogan era. Then I got out of it for many years and got back into it through the Attitude Era. Then I got out of it. Then I got back into it, when people were sort of, going back and looking at the nostalgia of the 80s and 90s. So it's kind of the same thing. And each time I would go back, I would sort of learn more and more about it and turn that clock backwards. And when we were starting to research Dark Side of the Ring to do stories for that show, we got really obsessed with like the story of Bruiser Brody or the story of the Von Erichs or, the story of Gino Hernandez, So we started to read a lot of books about the territory era, watch a lot of the footage, the other documentaries that were out. And it just really piqued our interest. And I think mainly because it's an era where, because wrestlers had to protect the business and live in their characters 24/7, and kayfabe was so enforced that it just kind of raised the stakes for everything. You had to live this character, breathe it, in and out of the ring. And that just kind of is a breeding ground for really wild and insane stories. Anytime you have to keep up appearances, with fans or with anyone in the world, you have to keep up this performance. That just is kind of just lends way to really crazy stories. Obviously, the lifestyle too back then, the excessive traveling, the substance abuse, all the kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll sort of aspect of wrestling back then. Again, just another, it just lends itself to crazy stories that you would never hear anywhere else. So that's what kind of got me interested in it. I also really appreciate just the wrestling of that era. I just really appreciate when you go back and you watch I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head, but even Memphis, I guess that's what's kind of where, as the episode aired, earlier this week, it's you kind of go back and you just see people hit differently back then and crowds reacted differently back then. And because it's not a fan culture, it's not a culture of we're wrestling fans and we know how it all works. It's literally the most blue collar people who are just kind of working their day jobs, and they, punch of the clock jobs. They come in and they go to their local town hall, where that's the entertainment, for the week. We're going to check out wrestling, and they get really into it. They're, under the spell of wrestling. Maybe they don't believe everything they see, but there's some aspects to it that they believe. So it's just a culture of watching that too, and just watching the audiences and these different little regional areas of America. It's so Americana, and so I just appreciate watching wrestling through that vein. Whereas watching wrestling today, and I don't mean to be crapping on modern wrestling, but you watch it and it's everybody pops at the same moment. There's all these in-jokes with the crowd, and there's kind of a semi-ironic appreciation of everything. So it's just, it doesn't have that magic, that sort of gray area magic that the territories was so awesome, for.
It's interesting you bring up how guarded it was. And yet, I mean, the success of both of your shows has been how much information you you as a filmmaker were able to divulge from people who guarded secrets for so many years. So, I mean, how did you achieve this? How did you convince people who guarded secrets for so many years to come out, sit around a table, and tell all their secrets to the world?
Well, I mean, I could talk a little bit about how the project came together too. I mean, because it really wasn't that hard. I mean, in terms of people wanting to talk about the business back then, because I think it's been so many years, and I think a lot of the wrestlers, especially those you've seen on the Memphis episode and the ones you'll see in the future. I mean, kayfabe's long gone. A lot of these guys have written books and they've done a lot of other interviews before. So, it's not so much about kind of peeling back the curtain. But in terms of how the project came together, it kind of dovetails into what I was saying before, is after Dark Side of the Ring season 1 came out, we were basically we noticed that The Rock had seen the show and he had tweeted about it, which was mind blowing for us as fans. We never would have thought that it would have been seen by someone like him, and that was huge for us. So right after following that, some mutual friends of myself and also the folks that work at $7, mainly Brian Gewirtz of WWE. He was the former head writer at WWE. Just kind of suggest we all meet, and we met, and it was kind of trying to come up with maybe a different series, something that wasn't Dark Side of the Ring, because we already were working on season 2. We were just getting into season 2. So is there another type of wrestling show we could create? And that's how, out of that, we sort of decided we wanted to do something with the territories. And I sort of went back and was noodling away at some ideas. And the one thing that I noticed, and I'm kind of circling back to your question, is I think I was at I was at one of those Starrcade, I think, events. Or sorry, Starrcast, Starrcast events in Las Vegas. And I just had this, and I've had this experience too, making Dark Side. Anytime you get wrestlers together, there's this organic thing that happens. And so I was at Starrcast. There was this bar I had walked into, and I saw Eric Bischoff. I think it was Road Warrior Animal, Sonny Ono. I saw Medusa, Scott Norton, all just hanging out. And I knew some of them from Dark Side. So I sat down, and I was just kind of a fly on the wall to them, being like a few drinks in, and just this organic ping-ponging of stories around the table. Like it was like, no, that reminds me of this one time when da ba da ba da, and and then the next person would go, and the next person would go, and it would just be this kind of like, it just never stopped. It could go to the end of, it could go to the following morning, if not farther, in terms of just endless stories, one kind of bouncing off the other. And so that to me was like, oh man, if you could recreate this environment. And wrestlers have been doing that for years on all those car rides and all on the road, in the locker room. That's what those guys do. They just, all these stories just get passed around, and I'm sure they get exaggerated over time, but that's how they have been kept alive, is just by being passed on in these car rides and in bar rooms, and so that for us was kind of like the starting point. Like if we could create a show that feels like that, but around the era of the territories, because stories from that era are guaranteed to be the craziest. So that was basically it, in terms of doing it. And then when we pitched the wrestlers to do it, it was kind of difficult to explain what we wanted the show to feel like, but I think once they got there and they all saw each other, they haven't seen each other in years, especially with the pandemic. And then as soon as they sat down and started just interacting with each other, the chemistry just, started to flow naturally, and then it was really, especially with the Memphis crew, like those guys were just fantastic. So, and then it sort of was writing itself, so to speak.
No, it was interesting. I was looking at that episode, and other than Jerry Lawler, it was the entire TNA creative team, right? I mean, if you actually look at it, it's pretty much those guys. But I mean, circling back to this question, and I mean, I hope you take this as a compliment, but the last season of Dark Side was so very controversial. A lot of, I would imagine that some people might be a little more reluctant than usual to come on camera and discuss some of the things, because of some of the flack that someone who wasn't involved in the events like say a Tommy Dreamer, he got a lot of flack just for his comments, right? So how did you get a crew that was so open, so very not reluctant to speak about their time in the past?
Well, I think with that episode, or I think with this show in particular, just knowing that, starting over and that this is a new series, it's not a journalistic series. It's not a series, Tales from the Territories is not a journalistic exercise where we're going in and we're trying to get to the bottom, separating fact from fiction. It's not exploring the quote dark side, quote, even though I think that could mean a lot of different things. And it was just sort of about like, wanting to approach it in a completely different way. For example, just having Dwayne as a partner too, opened doors for us with getting folks on the show that we never probably would have with Dark Side, and not because of season 3, but just because of the nature that it's an unauthorized sort of production. Like there's no WWE involvement, with Dark Side of the Ring. So, and Jerry Lawler, and you're going to see Michael Hayes on the, Mid-South episode. You're going to see some folks we've never had on Dark Side before. And just with that, having the relationship with Dwayne and $7, opened a lot of doors for us in terms of, getting talent on board. And I think it's just, this is a different show, and this show isn't necessarily about, one-on-one interviews and, where we're getting to the, into some tragic, territory here. This is a show about, the wrestlers and the camaraderie they had with each other, and just sort of reliving and rehashing their best stories. And, so for us, it wasn't really much of a challenge. In terms of getting people on board after season 3 or anything. It was more just a challenge of trying to communicate, in which ways this show is different, and also just, this is a new show, and we're trying to figure out what it is too, and hoping that it works. It was kind of conversely, like with Dark Side, it's like, like with that show, it's like you can rely upon doing separate interviews. You're telling one big story, and you have a lot of different voices you can get to contribute to that story in order to make it work. And what I mean by work is to sort of make it effective, on television, and to make it accurate and to balance it out and things like that. With this show, it's a lot higher risk in some ways, because in order for it to be successful and entertaining, because you're really relying on the chemistry of the wrestlers at the table, and you're really relying upon everybody, getting along, having good chemistry, laughing, and having good energy. And I think with the Memphis episode, it's 10 out of 10. Everybody, is working. It's like you really do feel like you're like kind of a fly on the wall, so to speak, to these guys, just sort of like reliving all these great memories. And so I think that's the hardest part for me, was just in terms of like getting the right people together, because sometimes you don't have the luxury of, like with the Memphis episode, you have like the fact that all those 5 guys are still around, and they get along. Not every territory you can say that about, and it's a little harder to find people like that. And so that was the hardest part, was getting the right people with the best stories that would have the best chemistry, and then just letting the cameras roll and making sure it's like entertaining, and not just entertaining for a wrestling fan. We never make shows just for wrestling fans, so it has to be, entertaining enough for like my parents would watch it and think it was cool, so that was the hardest part.
It's very interesting. You mentioned the kind of friendship that exists between everyone, and I mean, they're almost seated around like that 70s show kind of table, that kind of setup. And it starts off on a very like friendly kind of note, and then it goes into pulling eyeballs out and guns.
Yeah.
That.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But my question here is there a bucket list of maybe wrestlers that you would like to have on maybe a second season of the show? You have such a great cast already, like Jerry Lawler, Dutch Mantell, everyone else that we saw on Memphis. Yeah, is there a bucket list?
You mean for like if we were to do it all over again, that's people we didn't get? That's a good question. I'm sure that there are.
Mhm.
None's coming. I mean, we got some great people for this season. That I was super happy about. Like just like the Mid-South episode, which I think will be the last episode in the run. That's just a great panel. It's Jim Ross,
Wow.
Michael Hayes, Jake Roberts, and Ted DiBiase. It's just seeing them, and cigarettes are being smoked. It's just like the environment of it. You wouldn't see that, in any other, like the way that that's captured in the stories that are told. I just feel like you wouldn't see that in any other sort of platform, maybe on a podcast, but not with them together, and that was just so cool. It's just so cool to see that and to know that is something that's going to live on and endure. That's really cool. I'm trying to think. There's a lot of folks, I know it's not exactly answering your question, but there's a lot of folks who have passed on that, would have been amazing for the show, that the show is tailor-made for, and I always think about, Bobby Heenan, or I think about, Roddy Piper, like if Roddy Piper was still alive, and how amazing it would have been to have him on a show like this. It would have been just killer. Tons of folks like that, but man, yeah, I can't really think of anybody that off the top of my head. I'm sure it'll come to me after this, but there's so many territories out there and so many different configurations. And that's one thing too. Like that was one thing about kind of coming up with this idea, was that we didn't want it to be like a definitive examination of a territory. Like you watch the Memphis episode and, it's just these 5 weird stories. It doesn't tell the story of the territory. But that allows you to go back to Memphis, in a season 2, in a season 3, 4, 5, and have a different group of people. Maybe it's a different generation of people, and people who were there, towards the end. Maybe it's a different. So I think that's what's cool about the show too, is that it allows us to just like always, keep going, even with those territories. It's not like a definitive episode.
You mentioned the Attitude Era at the beginning, and The Rock is a part of this production. You mentioned what a great honor it was that The Rock saw Darkseid and became a fan of the show. What was your meeting with The Rock like? I mean, I'm assuming there was a physical meeting, right? Or several ones before the show was made.
There wasn't a physical meeting. Just a lot of correspondence. I mean, the man, he's a busy guy. He's got a lot going on between the various shows he's producing, the products that he has, the Black Adam, everything. It just the fact that he even has the time of day, to even be giving us notes or to communicate certain ideas to us, and to do that is just mind blowing to me. In terms of in terms of him, who who's just got so much going on. I remember when we first got started with the show, he was going back and rewatching. I think he watched Memphis Heat, that wonderful documentary, which anybody who's listening to this, if they haven't seen, you should definitely go out of your way and check it out. It's a great sort of companion piece to what to our show. But that is more of a definitive look at the territory. But I remember Dwayne had watched Memphis Heat, I think, like a few times, and was really fired up about when we were just about to go to camera for this show, and talking about ideas and thoughts about from Memphis Heat. Again, he had a lot of and great call that he made as well about wanting Jeff Jarrett in the episode too. And Jeff Jarrett, obviously, he had grown up in the territory. He had sort of been a part of it at the end, more towards the tail end. So I hadn't really thought in terms of getting wrestlers from that heyday, from the golden age era of those territories. And Jeff was later on, but it was such a good call that he had to push, to get Jeff on the show, because, man, Jeff Jarrett was killer on that show. He was so good. He was keeping everybody on track. He had grown up, I'm sure, heard these stories so many times, but even though he found a way, natural, he had this naturalistic way of sort of seeming like he was hearing these stories for the first time, and also being a conduit for the audience, knowing that these guys are going to shorthand a lot of the stories, and Jeff will be always keeping the audience in mind and sort of translating certain things or resetting up. He's like this de facto kind of moderator, and he was so good at it. And I think that I saw a lot of chatter online about people saying how awesome Jeff was in the episode. So that was a great note, just from Dwayne to be got to get Jeff Jarrett on there, and 100%. And that was such a good call. So the interactions that we've had is like just sort of in between the various things that he has going on, but we have sort of a daily connection with Brian Gewirtz and the folks over there at $7. So a lot is being passed around, from Dwayne to Brian to everyone in terms of just, getting the show made. Because this show was also made on a very tight timeline. There was a very quick turnaround on this show. We're still not even done with the show. We've only finished 3 of the 7 episodes. So, yeah. So, yeah, it's a lot going on.